Hi, and welcome to the channel. We're going to be continuing our discussion on John Wick in part 2 of this video series. And in part 2, we're going to take a closer look at the anatomy and the body of our John Wick character and how we're going to take some attempts to draw it in perspective. So stay tuned while we take a look at that, and a little bit later on in the video, I'm also going to kind of break into a little bit of a live drawing to show you one of the perspective tools that exist inside the Procreate app. So again, stick around for that. We'll be taking a look at it a little bit later. Now, as mentioned a little bit earlier, this is part 2 of a series, and in the first part, we constructed our Keanu Reeves John Wick head. So in this part, we're going to take a look at the body and how we got the rest of this composition together. I'll put a little link up in the corner there if you want to take a look at part 1. Now, if you're wondering, a little bit later, I'll show you the picture that I use as a reference for the body pose here. But what we're going to be doing is breaking down how we put the anatomy together. And I tend to do this in pieces. So I roughed in a kind of a rough rectangular shape as to how I wanted the shoulders and the body and the torso to line up. And then hid everything for a little while so that way I could just go and spend a little bit of time concentrating on the hands and the gun that are really going to kind of take up the foreground of this picture. I tend to draw in something of a comic book style, and what I mean by that is just mostly just trying to kind of exaggerate perspective sometimes to give you a more dynamic pose. And so this hand, or hands I guess I should say, are going to be overly large, actually in fact even larger than the head, to kind of give you that forced perspective look that I'm going for. Now let's talk about the gun. I struggled with this a little bit, and it was mostly because I didn't realize I was going to have to draw this thing in perspective in order for it to look natural sitting in his hands. And when you're drawing in perspective, that means the rest of the body needs to be drawn in perspective as well. So as you'll notice here, I'm kind of struggling with it. It just doesn't look right, and eventually I had to kind of give up on it and start all over again, knowing that a perspective grid was going to be necessary. And since I'm going to be getting into it, why don't we kind of pause the video right there? We'll get out of this little drawing here for just a second, and we'll take a look at the perspective tool inside Procreate Live and see how it lines up with the drawing that we ended up with at the end. Stay tuned. Okay, so here we are in Procreate, and as you can see here, I just kind of have a canvas up here with some of the John Wick pieces that I was working on. Now, a couple things I want to kind of point out before we get into the perspective tool. Number one, I'm going to take a small just peek at the brush set I'm using here. You may notice that I got a lot of brushes in here, but the reality is I don't really use most of them. I've done a couple of little tweaks here and there to the brushes just to kind of make them a little bit more, I don't know, comfortable in my hands, so to speak. But for the most part, again, I really kind of try to stick to the brush library that Procreate kind of by default provided with the app, and don't really get into this idea of going out and seeking out brush kits to download and stuff. Mostly I don't have the money for it, and secondly, I just really don't use a variety of brushes typically. So let me kind of point at the ones that I do use. Right now I'm on a sketch pencil brush, and this is just something I use to lay out those initial sketches. It's really not all that different than any sort of an inking brush, other than the fact that it has something of a rough texture, which reminds me of sketching with a pencil. It's the only real reason I use it. You won't see the sketch pencil, for the most part, ever really show up in any of my final work. It's just for me to rough out ideas. Now, when I get into the final phases of the line drawing, then I move into this little taper brush that you see right here. Now, the point of the taper brush is that it gives me that ability to kind of get thick and thin line, just depending on how hard I'm pressing with the brush. And that's really important when we get into line weights, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, getting into some of the final inking that I'm going to be doing with the line work there. All right. Now, a couple of the other brushes that I use here are soft brush and hard air brush, mostly for rendering shadows and lights and trying to get some of that subtle kind of soft edges to it. That's really about it. You'll see that there's some textures in there. I've tried fooling around with them. They don't really work all that well, so I don't really use them. So really, we're talking about 4 main brushes here: sketch pencil, the taper brush, and again, this is just something that's already in Procreate that I tweaked a little bit just to give it a little bit more of a thickness when I wanted it, and then soft airbrush and hard airbrush, and that's about all I use. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this here really quick. I pulled up just the rough sketch that we're going to end up with at the end of this particular video. This is how the final product is going to look before we move into our coloring phase. And on the right here, you can see the photograph that I was using as something of a rough reference for the drawing that we ended up with. Now, I made a couple of tweaks to it. You may notice that I've moved the gun down a little bit to kind of not hide his face so much. But for the most part, we're looking at what is essentially an exaggerated caricature. Exaggerated not only in the face, but in the body as well. Take a look at the angles on the shoulders there and the long kind of slender arms, the oversized hands. These are all really kind of meant to kind of invoke that John Wick feeling in the sense that, at least in my opinion, Keanu Reeves and the character John Wick himself is kind of tall and lanky, and so it needs to kind of come through not only just in his face, but in his body and his body language as well. So even though you may see that jacket in the picture there kind of flare out as it gets towards his waist, I kept it very, very skinny and more fitted to him just because it really kind of fit the character that I was trying to draw and the caricature that I was trying to achieve. If we're taking a look at the picture itself here, I'm just going to kind of zoom in a little bit. You may notice that we're trying to draw our character in perspective, which really isn't all that difficult to do because he's really kind of facing us. So we don't really have to worry about things going off into the distance or anything like that. But in the drawing over here, I did want to do that because it helps create a dynamic sense of action in the picture, if that makes sense. So take a look at this here really quick. If I draw a line right here, just kind of lining up the shoulders, and then I draw another line right here, lining up with the gun, then another one right here, lining up with the forearm, and so on and so forth. Even this finger right here, this all lines up into something of a perspective grid. Now you can take my word for it just based off the lines that I've drawn right here, or let me just go ahead and I'll back all that out there really quick. And what we can also do is open up a perspective grid. So if you take a look here, I'm going to go under this little kind of wrench-looking tool here up in the upper left-hand corner. I'm going to open it up, and under my canvas settings, I can set up a drawing guide. So right now there's a switch in the drawing guide indicating that it's off. I'm going to turn it on. And when I do, notice that a perspective grid has now lined up. Now I've already preset this perspective grid. So before we take a look at it, let me just kind of show you how to edit it. We do have an edit drawing guide option here. And once I do that, notice that I have down at the bottom here highlighted that I want to see a perspective drawing guide. The perspective drawing guide then allowed me to select a point, which I did right here, okay? And so once I put that point in and hit done, I now have some colored lines here on the page to give me something of a guide. And these colored lines never show up in any of the time-lapse videos that Procreate creates for you automatically. So anytime that I've used a perspective grid, it's never really shown up in any of the videos that I've posted onto my channel up until this point. It really kind of forced me to come into this live, so to speak, version of Procreate to show you how this really kind of works and how I've been using it in the past. So anytime you see something like this that I or maybe even some other artist has really kind of gotten in some really, really good perspective lines or some nice crisp lines, it's usually because we're using the tools at our disposal. And again, if I just highlight these for you one more time, because they may be a little bit difficult to see on the screen, we'll have a line here that just kind of lines up the shoulder work. That's not very straight. Let me try that again. So we have a line right here that lines up the shoulders, okay, just like that. Another one that lines up at the top of the gun, right? Then another one that lines up at the bottom of the gun, just a little something like that. Again, the finger gets involved in there as well. We have the forearm top, forearm bottom, and everything just kind of lines up right along these sets of lines here a little bit. Everything except for the head. And the head is facing dead on, so it's kind of the exception to the rule here a little bit. All right. Now, when I'm ready to get rid of this perspective grid and move on to the rest of my drawing, to hide it so I can kind of move on to some of the other phases, I just simply turn the switch off, and I'm ready to move on. Okay, now back into the time-lapse here, you can see that we've just basically trashed the gun and started over again, now with the perspective tool turned on. So again, I mentioned it earlier, but just a little bit of a reminder, the perspective tool is on. I can see the lines, but they don't show up in the time-lapse recording that Procreate provides, so you're not going to be able to see it here, but it is in fact turned on. Notice how the lines go in nice and smooth, and they all line up. This helps make the gun look a little bit more solid, a little bit more three-dimensional on the page. I've also overdrawn the lines. They're a little bit longer than they have to be, just to make sure that I have that barrel just kind of as solid as I can get it. And once I've got the little detail work and a little bit of lines and shine kind of represented, then I can draw in a few extra lines on a different layer to kind of cut off the end of it, erase the parts I don't want. And once I have all the lines the way I like, I'll merge them all together into kind of one final thing that makes up the gun and the hands together. So I'm drawing in just some representation of shadow here just to get an idea of where that's going to sit on the hand. And again, the idea is that I'm zooming in to get some of these shadows in, but then later zooming out so I can get this kind of as far back as I can, just to make sure that it just kind of seems like it sits and looks like an illusion of 3 dimensions on the page. Now bear in mind here, hands and gun are going to stay on their own layer. So now that I've turned on those layers that I was hiding before, just to kind of recap, I've got the head on a layer, the face, if you will, the hands and the gun on their own layer, and behind all that, the torso here that we're going to kind of fill in next. Now for the torso, it was really important that I also made sure that I took some attempts to kind of render some of the shadow in the initial sketch. And there's good reason for this. We'll talk about coloring in the next video, but just as something of a hint of what's to come, I'm using some unusual colors here, some purples and yellows and oranges. And because I'm not really all that accustomed to using those colors, I wanted to make sure that I had a good idea as where my shadows and my lights were really going to show up on this jacket. Not to mention the fact that the jacket is supposed to be black, and I don't want to render pure black here. It's going to make everything look flat. So it was really important, as I said before, to get some idea of where shadows and lights are going to lie, so I can use it as a guide to when I'm doing the coloring phase that we'll discuss in the next video. So now that I'm relatively happy with the composition here of a rough sketch, it's time to do the inking. And the inking is, again, going to take place over several layers. Now, a word about layers here. I'm trying to work in something of a higher definition and a larger canvas. I'm going to try to start printing some of these out as posters. And in that poster size at high def, at 300 DPI, it limits your layers. I've only got maybe about 20 some odd layers, maybe 25 layers to deal with here. And that's actually not a lot for me and my methods. So I'll just let you know I had to try to conserve as much as possible, but working in layers does help your coloring. So planning in advance for this is going to help out. The face is a great example of this. The face, the hair, they're all going to end up being on their same layer, but if I had more layers at my disposal, I would have put the hair on its own separate layer. Trying to be a little bit more conservative though, I drew the face in. A little bit later on I put in the hair and combined them both into one layer, so that way I could color them all separately from the rest of the composition. Now the important thing to keep in mind here is that when you're doing this line work, especially like when you get into that chin area, notice how the gun overlaps there, and that line is still drawn on the gun as well as the face, so that way there's no open line work. Anytime you have open line work, that means it's going to make your coloring later on that much harder, because you can't just do color fills. And again, the next video we'll talk about coloring, but coloring fills are going to save us a lot of time and effort, so it's important at this phase that all your line work is closed off and there's no gaps anywhere for paint to spill out, so to speak. Now again, different layers here. So if we're looking from top to bottom here, at the very, very top layer, the thing that's in the foreground, I'm going to have the final ink work that's just going to represent only the gun and the hands. And when it comes to the hands, they're going to be cut off at the wrist, right where the cuff of the shirt starts. The layer underneath that, the second layer, is going to be the head, including the hair. And then the third layer, underneath those top two, is going to be the arms and the torso. And again, they'll start at the cuff of the shirt and stop basically where the chin and the gun are. All those lines are all closed off, nothing's going to be open, so as I get into the final stages of the ink work here, what you'll see is some of the overlapping starting to happen. So see how the jacket kind of overlaps underneath where the hands are normally going to sit? You won't see that in the final drawing, but I'm keeping it that way so I can close off my lines and make sure that the coloring phase goes a little bit easier. So things will overlap now, but we'll see that kind of get cleaned up in the next video. As something of a last little detail, I decided to add in a little bit of a little piece of the tie. I think it just kind of helped the silhouette towards the bottom of the screen a little bit, gave it a little bit more balance. And then I made a subtle shift here to the initial sketch, because I realized as I was kind of finishing up and cleaning up my line work that I wasn't happy with the way the hand and the wrist interacted. It didn't look like it was a natural bend. So I went back, kind of hid the sketch for a little bit, just to focus on that hand and wrist and kind of dial in that angle that it bent, so that way it just looked, again, just slightly more natural. So once I've got everything I'm happy with here, then I can hide the layer that has the rough sketch on it, and I'm left with the final product right here. Again, we're looking at 3 layers right now, all piled up on top of each other, overlapping, and when we get into our coloring phase, we'll see a little bit more about why. So that wraps up this video. Again, part 3 is going to be coming in the near future. In the meantime, if you haven't had a chance, take a second and click on that subscribe button. Also, the like button helps me out a lot. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Hope to see you again soon, and thanks for your time.